Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do another round of audiobook recommendations. This time I'm focusing on science fiction, which if you weren't aware is one of my favorite genres. Specifically, I'm talking adult science fiction. I don't read a lot of young adult here, but I have done videos like this before because I love audiobooks. So I've done recommendations about fantasy as well as horror. So I'm going to have those linked in the cards and down in the description box. I am someone who constantly is reading audiobooks, and I am someone who's sensitive to good narration. So these specifically are books that not only have audiobook forms, but I really think are enhanced by that narration experience. Hopefully there are some underhyped ones on this book list that you have not heard of before, and I'm really excited to share them all with you. I primarily read audiobooks through my library, but I also use some other services like Libro.fm and Scribd. So I'm going to have links down below if you want to try it out for yourself. All that being said, let's get into the recommendations. First, I want to recommend a space opera called Escaping Exodus by Nikki Drayden, and this is set in a far future where humans have left Earth, but rather than colonizing planets, they have colonized these large spacefaring creatures, and so they move in and carve out their insides and make themselves a home. There is a big environmental impact on the creature, as you might imagine, having humans living inside of them, and so that is a key theme in this story. Specifically, the story follows two women. This story does involve a romance between the two of them. One is a member of the royal family who is going to take over and become the leader of this community, and the other one is a beast worker, meaning someone who actually works on carving out the beast and making it more habitable for the people, and she is much more lower class. They are entangled at the beginning of this story, but when the one character is forced to take on more of a leadership role in her community, she ends up breaking off ties and having to put her own duties first, and the story goes from there. This book has incredible diversity in it, not only of queer representation, as I mentioned, there are also plural family relationships, but you also get to see many people of color, and the author herself is someone who is a Black author. And what I really appreciate with the narration is, first and foremost, it's a dual narrator, which is something I really like to see, because when you have two perspectives, I like to have two distinct voices rather than the same narrator just trying to change their accent slightly. And not only that, but I like that the narrators they chose were actually people of color themselves, and so you really get that own voices, authentic experience being told from authentic voices themselves. So I really thought that added to the story, and despite the synopsis, it's a very easy story to understand. I'm not always a fan of reading really complicated science fiction as audiobooks, but this one made complete sense to me because the author really described everything in very accessible terms. So trust me, you can just go into the audiobook, you will understand everything you need to. And it's just a beautiful story with so many themes. It's very character focused, and I just fell in love. It's one of my personal favorites and cannot recommend it enough, specifically the audiobook experience, which is fantastic. Next, I want to mention a more popular one, and if you have not read it yet, I highly recommend checking out Ready Player One by Ernest Cline on audio. This, of course, is the story of a young man living in a dystopian future where the world has just gone downhill, and so in order to cope with that, most of society has moved online and used VR technology to connect to a world called the Oasis, which is this interactive world where you can do everything that we do on social media now, but again in a VR environment. In this story, there is a contest in order to get control of the Oasis, and this story is a wonderful Easter egg hunt that is full of 80s nostalgia and adventure and excitement, and it's just a really fun story. But the reason, of course, that I want to recommend this on audio is because I love the narrator, and that is Wil Wheaton. If you're not familiar, he was Wesley on The Next Generation of Star Trek, and I definitely know him first and foremost from there, but I think most people are just aware of him as a really geeky personality. He has made tons of guest appearances on The Big Bang Theory and is just in all the geeky internet spaces. So if you're looking for a geeky voice to tell a geeky story, he's really perfect for that. He is an actor, so he really does put on a performance. I've heard him talk on podcasts about how he really does treat it like a performance and not just simply reading the book. And you definitely get that there. So even if you read this book, because I believe I read it first as a physical copy and really enjoyed it, I then went back and got to listen to the audiobook version, fell in love, and it's one that I actually purchased and I reread constantly because I really think it's a great performance and I just love it. So if you are a fan of this book already but have not tried out the audiobook experience, highly recommend it. I think this is a more popular one on the list, so let's move on to something else. So if you are like me and already a fan of Wil Wheaton's work in Ready Player One but are looking for something a little more underhyped, I would also recommend Lockin by John Scalzi because this one is also narrated by Wil Wheaton and he does a fantastic job. This is a science fiction book set in a future where there is a flu-like virus that breaks out and causes a good percentage of the world's population to fall into this strange kind of coma. So their bodies are essentially paralyzed, but their minds are still fully active. And because so many people are affected by this, the governments work to research and create technology to allow these people to still exist and have full lives within society. So what they're able to do is put the minds of these people into these augmented bodies that allow them to walk around and act like regular able-bodied people again. And this book was really fascinating. At the core, this is actually a mystery novel because it follows an FBI agent who is just starting work on the job, and they happen to be a person who is in these augmented bodies and how they have certain abilities that are actually enhanced by their augmented bodies and in other ways that they run into different challenges and are limited by it. And I absolutely love this book. I think it is one that you do want to listen to carefully, at least to get the initial understanding of the world. But if you enjoy mystery books, I definitely recommend this one. And personally, I prefer the Wil Wheaton narration, but I do want to mention that there is also another audiobook available, which is done by a female narrator. And that is because, if you notice, this book is actually about a person named Chris. And I'm trying to use the they pronoun because within the book, the way it's told in the first person perspective, we never actually find out whether this person is actually male or female, and that was done very purposefully. And so because of that, they made the choice to actually create two different versions of the audiobook narration. So depending on which one you chose to listen to, you might have a leaning of thinking that the character is female or male, but that was done on purpose. And I think it's just a really good play on gender and our expectations around that. So definitely one I recommend. Like I said, I lean towards the Wil Wheaton performance only because I love his reading so much, but I think it'd be really cool to try it again with the female narrator. So that's something I might do in the future if I get a chance. Next, I want to recommend Saturn Run by John Sanford and Katen. And this is actually a science fiction thriller. And I do think that thrillers can work really well in the audiobook form because they're often much more focused on an exciting plot, and it's really easy to hold your attention even if you're doing other things at the same time while listening to the audiobook. And that was definitely the case here. This book is set in a reasonably close future where humans have detected that there is some kind of movement by Saturn. They notice an object that is decelerating, and because that doesn't happen naturally, they believe that there is an alien presence circling around Saturn. And so both the American government and the Chinese government rush to make ships to go off and find out what is there. And so this is such a gripping story. At the beginning, it's kind of a space race of both governments trying to get their rockets ready to go as soon as possible, and then you get to follow them as they are going through space to find out what is at Saturn. I don't want to spoil anything, but I found it so gripping. I was dying to know what they were going to find there. Are these aliens friendly? What is going to take place? And I think that the audiobook narration really played into my excitement in this book because the narrator did a really good job. This narrator actually reminded me a lot of Wil Wheaton because I found that he had a similar cadence in his voice. I think perhaps they might be from a similar part of America, and while it's not an exact replication, it definitely had a similar vibe to it. So if you enjoy narration like Wil Wheaton, I definitely recommend checking out this book. And wow, I was so gripped in from start to finish. I was just dying to know what was going to happen in this book. There's a lot of hard science, but it's explained in a way that's very accessible to lay people like myself. And at the end of the book, you actually get an explanation of how some of the science in the book worked out, and absolutely loved it. But in terms of a performance, it was stellar. It's actually a fairly long audiobook, one of the longer ones I'm going to mention here, but despite that, I was completely gripped and would definitely recommend it, especially if you're a fan of science fiction thrillers. It's easily one of the best I've read in the last few years. After that, I want to recommend the Lady Astronaut series, which starts with The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal. And this is set in the 1950s, so it's actually historical science fiction, which is a little bit different. And there is a cataclysmic meteorite event which causes major changes in the atmosphere, and the climate change that is going to ensue, we soon realize is going to make the Earth inhabitable much sooner than was ever predicted in the past. And so because of this, the space program is accelerated because people need to get off the Earth much sooner and onto other colonies in a shorter period. And so in order to accomplish this goal, the government has to start to allow not only male astronauts, but actually some female astronauts. The story is told from one of those women who was a pilot and is shortlisted for the astronaut program. And this book has some fantastic diversity. The character herself is of Jewish religion and descent. And then you also get different characters of different racial backgrounds, people of color, and there's some great conversations in this book. Now, I specifically want to recommend this book on audio because it's narrated by the author herself. I've said in previous videos that when authors try to read their own fiction, it doesn't always go very well, but that's not the case here, quite the opposite. She is a professional audiobook narrator that has narrated plenty of other people's books, and so it only makes sense that she reads her own, and she does a fantastic job. I was absolutely gripped into these books, and because it's an ongoing series, I became so attached to the narration that when I had opportunities to read the book in physical form, I actually held off and waited until I had the opportunity to read the audiobook version because I was so invested in her performance that I really didn't want to experience the book anywhere else. And I think she just brings a lot of emotion into the story. I really felt for the characters, and I just found myself just dying to continue to read the book, which is always a good sign. So definitely recommend it on audio if you have a chance. It's a fantastic experience. And finally, I can't do an audiobook recommendations video without talking about one of my personal favorites, and that of course is The Martian by Andy Weir. It's a pretty well-known one, but just in case, of course, it's about a man who was stranded on Mars, and this book is a bit of a survival story. You get to follow this character as he is trying to use science in order to last until NASA can discover that he is still alive and hopefully plan a rescue mission for him. This book is so exciting and gripping and funny at the same time for a book about a man left on Mars. It is so hilarious, and the tone of this book is made even more fun and lighthearted by the performance. I personally read the original narration, which is done by R.C. Bray, and I really recommend it. He also does a lot of like mysteries and thrillers, and he has a really good gritty voice. And to me, when I hear that voice, that is the voice of this main character, Mark Watney. I understand now, looking at Audible, that they've actually done a new narration done by Wil Wheaton because he's such a popular geeky narrator. I personally would actually recommend trying the original narration just because I think he captured the story so well. You know I love Wil Wheaton, but for me, R.C. Bray is always the OG narrator for this, and again, is just the voice of this story. So highly recommend it, even again, if you read it as a physical book. If you're someone who enjoys rereading books, definitely try out the audiobook narration. It was so funny, so enjoyable, and just an entertaining way to spend a couple days. So absolutely recommend the audiobook narration. Love this one so much, and I just had to include it here. So that is it for this video. As always, I would love to hear down below if you are planning on picking up any of the audiobooks I mentioned here. Also, don't forget to check out my other recommendation videos, which are going to be linked down below if you want to hear about some adult fantasy and some adult horror books that work really well in the audiobook form. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of science fiction as well as horror, fantasy, and a little bit of thrillers. And if you are already already subscribed, help me out with dropping a comment, giving this video a thumbs up, hitting that notification bell, and even more so, sharing this video online, because that's how other people learn about my channel. So if you enjoy my content, I would appreciate if you'd share it elsewhere. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.